This is E&P Reports from Editor and Publisher Magazine, the authoritative voice of news media since 1884, serving newspapers, broadcasts, digital, and all multimedia news publishing. And greetings once again, Mike Blinder, publisher of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Quick housekeeping as always, if you are listening to us on a podcast platform, we urge you to follow us. Watching us on YouTube, there is a subscribe button below me. There's a bell to the right. If you hit that, you'll get an update each and every time we upload a new episode of E&P Reports. We've got some pretty smart people on this panel today. First of all, let me introduce Tim Franklin. Tim, you're Senior Associate Dean Professor and the John M. Mutz Chair. Am I saying that right in local news?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
At Northwestern University, Medill. Everybody knows that you guys are always putting out great content there. Before joining Medill, President of the Poynter Institute. So you know my hometown, Tampa Bay, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Beautiful area.
I'm in Lutz, just north of the city. You know, I've never.
Oh, sure.
For you. Penelope Muse Abernathy. Since I know you, I'm allowed to call you Penny. Am I correct?
That is right.
Okay, you're the visiting professor of Northwestern University Medill School of Journalism. You worked at the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Knight Chair in Journalism and Digital Media and Economics at the University of North Carolina. Most importantly, all this is great. Your pedigree is great, Penny. You wrote a book I read in 2020, News Deserts and Ghost Newspapers. You were like the first to put out the warning, wouldn't you say? Or that book got a lot of buzz back in 2020.
Yeah, you know, it actually wasn't the first one. The first one was in 2016, but the wonderful thing about the 2020 report was it did get a lot of buzz, raised a lot of awareness of what's at stake. So thank you, Mike, for having us both on here to talk about the most recent report.
And I want to introduce from our editorial team, a journalist that writes for E&P, Victoria Holmes is coming to us from Dallas, Texas. Victoria, you're going to keep me honest, right? And make sure I stay on the journalistic track here, right?
That's right, sir. Exactly.
Thanks. We're going to talk about the latest report, the State of Local News 2022, just issued, and we're going to get to that on the backside of this message.
This episode of E&P Reports is sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide are asking the same question. How do we accelerate the growth of consumer revenue? Traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way, costing you money. IQ Audience Plus by Town News is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers you to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Ready to supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income? Visit townnews.com/EP today to learn more about IQ Audience Plus by Town News.
Let's start off with you, Penny. This report that just came out, the State of Local News 2022, Expanding News Deserts, Growing Gaps, Emerging Models. This is kind of an ongoing study, isn't it, Penny? I mean, it's almost like an extension of 2020, and there's always going to be new information added to it.
Well, we hope it's going to be an ongoing study. I think we're at a state in the industry where the change is happening so fast that we really need to periodically step in and say, what's working, where is it working, and where are there still gaps? So that was why this report was done with that in mind. And I think it married up really well with all that is going on at Medill School, where the local news initiative has really been focused on what are the evolving business models for news organizations going forward.
Before we get into the details of the report, Tim, what is Medill's commitment? How is this financed? And why is Medill all in when it comes to tracking, I guess, the growth of news deserts or the compression of the industry? Why is Medill really into this? What is the purpose and the funding?
Well, I think this is perhaps the most crucial issue facing the news industry, and one of the most crucial issues facing our democracy right now is the availability of local news and information. So Medill is very committed to this. We launched the Medill Local News Initiative in April of 2018 with funding from the Lilly Endowment. We've also had funding from McCormick and now from Google News. and a number of other private donors. The Microsoft Journalism Initiative generously funded this report that we just released. But when I was at Poynter and worked with news organizations when I was at Poynter, it was obvious that the industry needed research and development help. And so that's what this is all about. It's doing research that maybe many in the local news industry wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And we're also developing new tools like the Medill Subscriber Engagement Index, which is allowing local news organizations for free to have access to the behaviors of their local news readers. It benchmarks how they're doing with peers across the country, and they can measure their own performance on this index. So, and then we're also working directly with news organizations in Chicago on audience research, audience development, and financial strategies. So, the work it's a passion project, and it's having, I hope, real impact.
There couldn't be a better time for this. As E&P has been reporting, there are two bills running through Congress right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, Penny, and I know you're aware of them. The JCPA, which is some call the Safe Harbor Bill,
Right.
which is I was surprised it had so much bipartisan support. That basically is allowing us to bargain collectively. I know I'm doing this quickly, giving the 30,000 foot,
Right.
but letting a local news publishers work together and bargain collectively against the big tech giants that I don't want to say exploit the news, but use our content, monetize it, and we don't get any compensation for it. So I got to admit, your timing is brilliant, because I'm assuming one of the reasons the timing of getting this report out was because this is currently a bill that's active in Congress right now.
Well, I think that there are a lot of things that are coming together right now. And what we really thought was that after the pandemic, we really needed to see where do we stand after the pandemic. Let me get back and talk about that bill. There are actually two, right, as you mentioned.
Right.
The other one is the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. They both have those initials, so it's you can get them confused. What's interesting about the first bill that you talked about, where you can come together and collect, is that what we basically had is an algorithm choosing our news, and an algorithm is going to discriminate against something that has large scale, right? That's shared a lot, that tends to be national news. And we've had a loss of local news. So the interesting point for me is looking at what has happened in Australia, now happening in Canada, where you've begun to see a group of news organizations coming together and actually negotiating with Facebook and Google. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to that bill, whether and whether we have lessons we can learn from Australia. The second bill is more concerned about giving a tax credit to organizations that hire news organizations. So both of these bills to me are kind of paradigm shifts from the way we've usually thought of national legislation. One looks at how can we give tax credits? In other words, can we begin to get public money in to support some news organizations? The other one is, can we agree to not say that this is antitrust and let news organizations who've been really hurt badly by the advent of these large tech groups, maybe not intentionally, but it is nevertheless decimated the business models that that basically supported good journalism for the last 200 years here.
Well, Tim, you said it. You said, in a Madisonian democracy, I always say we had some brilliant men a couple hundred years ago who were not perfect, who wrote a perfect document. I mean, in a way, which everybody's always trying to shred every now and then and rip apart, but it always holds together. In that document is a final check on power, which requires a free, unfettered press. So I know you guys believe in that, Medill, because you're constantly reinforcing that as keeping us in top of mind. But I want to pose a question I pose all the time when we discuss this legislation. What is local news? How do you define the journalism? How do you get the fake news away from the real news? Is a blogger in their pajamas with the cat on their lap a local journalist? And does that give you a tag? Or am I asking it an absurd question? I mean, Tim, do you have a thought on that? And I don't want to I didn't mean a gotcha question, but can we police ourselves? Because in our democracy, government cannot determine what is news, correct? If we go down that road, we are no longer following the path of our Constitution.
Absolutely. And you posed one of the most difficult questions. How do you define a journalist in this era? What is a journalist? Is it someone writing a column on Substack, a journalist, or is somebody just independently blogging a journalist? I guess what I would say is it a local news organization that that has an ethics policy, that is a general interest publication that's serving an entire community? And you can, I think, as a discerning reader, tell what is a legitimate news organization and what isn't. I think what's important in this report is that it shows the loss of these local news organizations that's happening. And then the question is, what comes in behind them?
There you go.
When they are lost. And as Penny pointed out, the problem is there's no replacement in many cases. So then what happens when there's no replacement, when there's no digital news organization or another news outlet that comes in? And what happens is, as Penny wrote, this malignant spread of misinformation and disinformation in our society. It's lack of accountability. And there's been research done showing that when there's no local news organization, that government spending goes up, that
Right.
borrowing costs go up, that civic participation goes down, local turnout in elections goes down. I mean, we're talking very tangible consequences.
It's all it's documented. It's amazing. Corruption grows.
Yes.
I like, if I may over metaphor this program today, I always like to say when we have a news desert, people become thirstier and they'll drink anything. Does that make sense, Penny? I mean, is that your finding?
Absolutely. Several people have said to me, why don't you call it a news vacuum? And because in fact, there's stuff that grows in a news desert. It's just not what you think of as the bountiful produce that you would want to eat that from a more temperate, more ecologically balanced environment. So, I mean, I think we define news deserts as a place where residents in a community have very limited access to the sort of news and information that helps them make good everyday decisions, as well as good decisions that will affect the long-term quality of life of future generations. So, I mean, do you have information on education? Do you have information on the environment? Do you have information on health? Do you have information on the economy and what the problems are? I have two favorite definitions, if you'll indulge me for just a moment, that come from esteemed professors, more esteemed than I. One defines a good local newspaper as a problem solver. Another one says a good local newspaper shows you how you're related to people you might not know you're related to. Wow. So when we lose that, we lose an ability as a society to kind of come together to solve the problems that we're confronting, or to collaborate with other people to build a solution or to take advantage of the opportunity we have.
Now, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I have a question in regards to, one is a clarification and one is a follow-up. But when it comes to some of these regulations and some of the people backing these regulations and corporations that are pushing forward, supporting local news initiatives, is there some sort of, I don't want to say mistrust, but should we be aware of these companies and maybe what they're doing? And is there some sort of conflict between corporations and companies helping news initiatives? Like, where would we draw the line between the actual kind of newsroom and how these corporations might fund these local newsrooms or backing these initiatives? I hope that makes sense.
Yes. So a lot to chew on there in that question.
She's discussing obviously Facebook and Google, correct?
No, right, sure, and it's a very good question. Look, we are seeing. I don't know about companies so much. We are seeing foundations, especially, begin to fund beats and begin to fund positions at local news organizations that they deem important to the community, whether it's the environment beat, the education beat, or others. I think in those cases that it's all about transparency, and it's about disclosing to the reader that this work is being funded by a foundation, or as you suggest, perhaps by a corporation. I think that absolutely needs to be disclosed. And I guess I would also just point out that in terms of the research that went into this report, which Microsoft helped underwrite, there were no caveats, no restrictions, no dictates, nor would we have accepted any in terms of what we looked at as part of this report. So, but you are seeing the Google News Initiative has put $300 million into various local news initiatives. Meta, or formerly known as Facebook, also has pumped in about $300 million into various local news initiatives. Most of those have to do with training and development of new tools to help local news organizations.
But okay, I was at the mega conference in Orlando. I didn't mean the first thing, but this is a very valid point. It was a little uncomfortable when Google was presenting to an audience, and the audience would have asked them really pointed questions. But I think you're right. I mean, they're putting $600 million into an industry, but that's still just a rounding error in some. These are huge companies, but we got to respect. What I'm hearing here, which is important, because I think Victoria brought up another topic, because we are doing a lot of reporting now on philanthropic news organizations that are growing, that are locally funded. And if you got someone on your board from a big corporation there, I think you're right, Tim, and you agree, don't you, Penny? You got to be pretty transparent that board should not dictate at all to the editorial team, right, Penny? And that's just journalism 101, or do you see that could be a problem in the years to come?
Well, I want to answer it first. Transparency is really important. That's what journalists provide on transparency on government. And even if they don't expose corruption, they're at least preventing it by by exposing what they do and what are providing transparency. But I think the second thing is we need to think we've always had a wall between advertising and journalism. We need to be very clear with any donation we get. What is the wall that separates a donor from dictating exactly what you're going to study, what the result is going to be, what you're going to do with the money that comes in? And from there, you can then be very transparent about what you're doing. But I mean, I do think there's all calls for a new set of rules that I think most news organizations have begun to grapple with. And I mean, it's transparency is important, but also maintaining some sense of a separation between an ability to dictate is
now, go ahead. Did you want to say something, Tim, or you?
I was just going to say that as long as there have been newspapers in the history of newspapers in America, there has been pressure by special interests to influence coverage. This is not a new thing. It's not a new phenomenon. And I would argue there's actually more transparency now than there's ever been in news coverage. So whether it was advertisers, trying to pressure the outcome of a story, whether it was a politician, whether it was a local business institution, there have always been these pressures. The question is having the ethics and the the editorial separation of those influences from the newsroom.
All right. Okay. So now that we've discussed everything at 30,000 feet, let's dive into what this report says. Although there is a link for those of you that might be listening to us in Spotify or Google Play or Apple, go to editorandpublisher.com/podcast, vodcast, editorandpublisher.com/vodcast. We'll give you a link because this is a free report. But if I may, Penny, let's just run it down. The first thing I like what you do is you throw some quick numbers out there. You establish again what we all know, the compression, the extinction, whatever you want to call it. But right now, we're on track to lose, since 2005, the country has lost more than a fourth of its newspapers, 2,500. We're on track to lose a third by 2025, correct?
That's
360 between 360 alone during COVID went out of business, correct?
That's correct.
All but 24 of those papers were weekly, serving communities. Wow. Now that's so what I loved what you brought out in this report is that weeklies can be profitable. We see profitability. I mean, yeah, being a big daily, distribution costs, print, all that and more. But if you're running a weekly, you can run a nice, profitable business. But then you point out something that's interesting. the ones that are working are the ones in the affluent neighborhoods, correct? But the communities where there's less of an advertiser base or less of a subscriber base are the ones that are hurting the worst. I mean, is this what your findings show, Penny?
Well, that's the first level. So, I mean, where the news organization is located is very critical. If it's in an affluent or growing community, you're going to have people who can pay for the news, or you're going to have advertisers who want to reach those affluent people. And so you've got money coming in. Now, what the other point I make is there are two things that can compensate for that. One is if you have an entrepreneurial, strategic owner who can respond to the local needs and expectations of the community where they're located.
Okay.
And that tends to be an independent owner, right? Because many of the chains have kind of a set notion of how they're going to do things. But we found that independent owners tend to be, that have survived and that are in good communities, tend to have that. The second thing is that can compensate for that is if you've got enough support in the community for either a for-profit or nonprofit model. And I think the thing that's most concerning for me is that when we look at the data, you typically have more philanthropic money located in the same communities where you have more affluent people living. So that sets up a real emerging divergence between communities that have local news and those who face the prospect of having a little bit or none at all.
You also point out that a fifth of our citizens now live in news deserts.
Right.
Again, and most probably, and definitely, those citizens are living in a less affluent area because, as you said, it's just not, okay, we're going back to another metaphor. It's not a fertile ground to grow. How many metaphors are we going to get thrown in here today? To grow local news. But then you throw in another part of this perfect storm. The surviving newspapers, especially the dailies, are operated by mostly hedge funds, large corporations that aren't putting a lot of effort and energy into the newsrooms, correct? They're just stripping.
Well, I think what we can say is that we had kind of flow into the market in the last decade and a half, a large number of investment entities, whether you want to call them hedge funds, you want to call them private equity, institutional investors. And while they had traditionally, purchased stock, they decided they were going to run newspapers. And the problem with having institutional investors or investment entities run a newspaper is they have one purpose in life, and that is return on shareholder, right, which is very, very different from the traditional newspaper chains we had, whether it was the New York Times, the Knight Ridders, the Gannett's, the Hearst, the private ones that came up. They carried either the name of the family that founded it, or they carried the brand of the name of the flagship newspaper. And there's something about having a commitment to civic journalism there that you don't have if you have an institutional investor there. So if you look at what has happened in terms of laying off staff, in terms of shuttering newspapers, as the stats show in the report, roughly a third of the newspapers that were closed in the last 3 years were done by the top 10 chains. More than half of the ones that were closed or merged in the last 10 years were done by the top 10 chains. If you look at the fact that we've lost more than 60% of our reporters in newsrooms, a disproportionate number of those have been in large chains. So that you have newspapers, daily newspapers that used to have 200, 300, 400 in a newsroom today that only have a few dozen. And when you lose a reporter at a local newspaper that shut down, you've lost the person that shows up at the school board meeting, lost the person that shows up at the county commissioner meeting.
There you go.
When you lose the reporter at the state and metro papers, you're losing the investigative reporters. You're losing the beat reporters that covered education and pull together all the trends in a state and help change policy or environment, or the state legislative reporters. So, we've had a kind of sucking noise going on I like to look at the newspaper ecosystem is kind of a pyramid. And if you look at it as a pyramid, all but about 150 newspapers are in the base. And those are the small dailies and the weeklies that feed the news up to the 150 or so state and metro that in turn feed it up to the 4 national newspapers. So, that is a concern as we look at it. We can measure loss of news in 2 ways. We can measure it in terms of loss of newspapers. We can measure it in terms of loss of journalism.
There you go.
And if I could just quickly add on to what Penny said, in some ways it's so short-sighted to just continually cut. Because we're now in this world where there's an increased emphasis on reader revenue. 2020 was the first year in which reader revenue composed more revenue for local news organizations than advertising revenue did.
Right.
And that's just going to continue to grow and is continuing to grow. So, you have to provide a product that people are willing to pay for. You have to provide a product that people are willing to turn over their credit cards to a news organization because there's value there and because they want and covet the information that's contained in that local news organization. And if you're not doing that, if you're just a ghost newspaper that doesn't have original local reporting in it, pretty soon people are going to stop giving their credit card information to you, or they're going to pull it back. This is something that's as old as capitalism, right? It's producing a product that people are willing to pay for. And I hope that we can somehow, some way, get past sort of the short-sightedness of these cuts. What worries me, and Penny and I were talking about this yesterday, is we now live in this inflationary environment. Inflation's 8-9%. Newsprint prices are going through the roof. Gas prices are going through the roof, which is driving up distribution costs for local news outlets. So, those are putting even more pressures, financial pressures, on local news organizations. And I think we'll see what happens. Is that going to accelerate the transition from print to digital because digital is more economical? So I think we'll see, but it's an interesting time.
Victoria, you seem to have a question. I saw you were about to jump in there. What question do you have for our panel here?
I was going to say it's not really a question, but more of an insight. I just came back from the Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference that happened in Denver, Colorado. And I noticed that the newsrooms that only had reporters who had like maybe 2 deadlines a week ended up becoming more successful than the newsrooms that had daily deadlines. And those newsrooms that had daily deadlines were also, not only were they firing reporters, but the reporters that were there also quit. And so it was really interesting to see that you don't need to have, well, from my perspective, you don't need to have like something pushed out daily in order to have successful readership, successful revenue. And that kind of reaffirmed like the path towards, at least my idea, the path towards investigative long form journalism is probably the best journalism to create revenue because that's what readers want.
I see you nodding your head on that one, Penny. Do you have something you want to say?
Well, I think that one thing I would refer to is a great study that was done by Jay Hamilton at Stanford in his book, Democracy's Detectives, where he looked at how much we have lost in terms of investigative reporting. And back to what Victoria was saying, I mean, I think it gets back to what Tim is saying. What do I read in the paper that I can't get anywhere else? What am I reading that is going to affect the quality of my life? And investigative reporting is one of those things that is vitally important, as is having really good beat reporting on education, as is having really good beat reporting on environment or health. I mean, we saw how important health reporting is with the recent pandemic. So, I mean, I think I'm also struck too, having been in teaching for since 2008, what really occurred to me was I heard more and more students refer them to themselves as content gerbils in the beginning around 2012. And I think it really is, if you're always chasing clicks, you're always chasing getting something out there fast, we're not stopping to think what is the value that we're actually providing the reader. And that, I think, is back to what Tim says, what the value you're providing the reader is more important than ever.
It's a great question, Victoria, that you asked. And in the Medill Index, we have 104 local news outlets. We track reader regularity by content type for all of these news organizations, and consistently, and there are variances across markets, but consistently among the most top read things are original, unique, enterprise reporting. And that's what people are willing to pay for. And it's consistent in all the research that we've seen over the past several years. So yes, I think that absolutely is what people value. And Penny in the report also chronicled how the reduction in print frequency of the 100 largest publications. Penny, how many are still 7 days a week? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we had the number.
No, I think a better way to say it is only 11 are 2 times a week or less, and 40 of the 100 largest are less than 6 or less a day. So it's it is a interesting trend to start thinking about what's important and when do you cover it. For me, I mean, having dealt at both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal with the many European and Asian newspapers, most dailies were 6 times a week, not 7. And of course, kind of the industry secret has been that for most dailies, there were only about 3 days that were profitable. It's just those days were so profitable, they furnished they allowed you to print 7 days a week. So I think it's a real good and an interesting time to think about as you cut back on your publication, what is the value and how are you doing that for your readers, and what does that, how do you continue to get them to come to you?
There's another part of the report that I want to bring up, and I got shot down on this very program a few months ago. I don't want to it was me commenting when I was interviewing a philanthropic organization that was funding a brand new city, digital only startup in a city that has a lot, 4 television operations, a large daily newspaper, several weeklies, several magazines. I said, you can't possibly tell me there's a news desert there. And then everybody, of course there is, because no one's covering this aspect of the society or this aspect. They're getting into microcosm. And I'm not saying that's bad. I mean, there's a place for Block Club Chicago that has a reporter embedded into every neighborhood to be hyper local. But you say here, despite the recent increases, I'm quoting your report now, Penny, despite the recent increases in both corporate and philanthropic funds, the footprint of digital only news sites is small and predominantly a big city phenomenon. That to me backs up what I was saying, because to me, wouldn't that money go better into, I don't know, a Midwestern small market that is now completely void of any local news operation? What say you to that, Penny?
Well, I think that is one, we look to digital outlets to be the savior. And I think there are a lot of structural reasons it has not taken off yet. One of the things that I think that entrepreneurs have learned is a lot easier in many ways to go in with a legacy operation like a newspaper that already has an audience than it is to try to build one. So one of the problems we've had with a lack of expansion of digital outlets is that we're losing only slightly less than we're gaining. So, and that's especially true with for-profit models going forward. With the nonprofit model, the real problem has been that most of the largely endowed philanthropic organizations that have the potential to give to news organizations are located in the very big cities. And so, funders, people seeking funding go where the funders are. And so 90% of what we've got so far in terms of digital operations are located either in a state capital or in a right. city. And here's another problem to throw onto that, Mike, is that those are usually cities that are well digitally connected. So, to me, I really look to the nonprofits like a Carolina Public Press that has made it to 11 years and has managed to somehow grow from something done literally over the founder's kitchen table to an organization that covers an entire state. But the founder will tell you she worries about how she gets the news that they produce to the people that need it the most, given the lack of digital coverage in many of the 100 communities that North Carolina has. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of issues we need to think about in terms of building on that base of digital outlets in order to get the good news that is being done by some of these nonprofit sites out into the community where people need it the most.
Tim, you want to add to that at all from on the Medill's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there's not enough philanthropic support to go around to support all of the news desert communities, especially in smaller rural areas. There's just not. It's unfortunate. And don't get me wrong, I think foundations and philanthropies have really stepped up big time over the past few years in providing support for local news. So what does that mean? So I think it means that we need to figure out creatively as an industry and as an academy how we can also reinvent and support commercial local news organizations in these areas. We just have to figure that out. And we're seeing some examples of some really creative entrepreneurial work happening in smaller communities around the country. Penny and I talk about the pilot in North Carolina with David Warnock, who's done a fabulous job diversifying his revenue base, and they're thriving and doing really great journalism. And so, that's just one of many examples, I think, of what we need to be thinking about in terms of also helping reinvent legacies.
Victoria, we're running out of time. Do you have one more question on your mind before we have to bring this thing home?
Not another question, but just another insight. I ended up actually leaving the newsroom that I was a part of simply because there was no resources for me to cover North Carolina and all the counties that we had to cover in North Carolina, because I covered Eastern North Carolina. So I guess to kind of wrap it up, or kind of just offer a last minute insight or a question to ponder on, is in order to reach that readership, and the readership that doesn't have access, because a lot of rural communities in North Carolina especially don't have reliable internet, is print the only answer to trying to reach that readership? Or does it look more like something physical, like going in person and having, really, really old school 1800s, like a town yeller or something, a town crier, something like that? Because I was pushing out digital news stories, but there's no way someone in Ocracoke would be able to have, reliable access to those stories about back then COVID numbers, about where vaccination sites are, so does the next way of going into these news deserts, is that a physical aspect? Does that look like something that would happen physically instead of just over this metaverse that's becoming with us?
I think instead of going backwards, we also need to think about going forward too. And I do think in person is very important. There's a project, the Relevance Project, that talks about how important it is for people to be seen in the community, be seen as bringing together solutions and the like. But I think that also we need to be very conscious of how do people get news, right? So right now, if you're in a rural area, you're limited somewhat to social media to track COVID, for instance, right? And what's the most friendly? What's one of the friendliest apps on your phone is Facebook, right? But there's also texting. There's a whole range of things. There are newsletters. There are a whole range of things that we can start thinking about. Again, Carolina Press is in the process of doing a survey right now that is asking people across the state, how do they get their news? How would they want to get their news? And in what language do they want to get their news? So, I think it is not only a question for rural America. Let me also say, I know of another example that's going on in Baltimore right now, where Morgan State is trying to do the same thing with several neighborhoods that do not have good internet connection, and bring the news to people who need it the most.
The report's called The State of Local News 2022. Tim, this is published as we speak on the local news initiative site, correct? At Medill. Can you give us the web address for that, please?
Sure. It's local news initiative .northwestern.edu. So if you, or you can Google local news initiative at Northwestern or local news initiative at Medill.
You also have another post there that I went through, which is great. I mean, did an amazing job. A link to a brief overview of efforts to bolster local news. You call it Saving Local News. Is that new or just a culmination of all the stuff you've been doing over the past few months or so?
No, it was new. As part of this project, we wanted to yes, we wanted to and needed to chronicle what was happening with local news organizations across the country, but we also wanted to write about and talk about steps that are underway to help local news around the country. So we have a summary of a number of major efforts underway to help local news across the country, from legislative to academic to university efforts to philanthropic efforts and so forth.
Penny, you're not done, right? I see links to Coming Soon, the rise of the large regional newspaper baron. There's a mouth, the rise of the large regional newspaper barons. I love that. And then you also have Future of the Daily Newspaper. What's coming around the corner? What else are you going to be publishing soon?
Where we're also going to look at what has been, we're going to look at some of these long-term sustainable digital sites. What's been the key? What have been the lessons people have learned from those? And then finally, Tim and I are going to take a stab at kind of looking at what could be some future next steps going forward. So we want to keep this. We want to keep this looking forward. We want to stop periodically and say, again, what's working, where is it working, and where are the gaps? But we then want to say, how do we come up with solutions to fill those gaps?
Well, Victoria and I would love to have you two back once you start publishing this new information, so we can stay on top of it and spread it across the the industry. Penny, thank you so much. Penny Abernathy, a visiting professor at Northwestern University, Medill School of Journalism. Of course, Tim Franklin, senior associate dean professor, and John M. Mutes, chair on local news at Northwestern University, Medill, and of course our own Victoria Holmes from our editorial department. You guys keep up the good work. Keep publishing this, and by all means, keep in touch with ENP. We'd like to keep reporting on this. Thank you.
Love to. Thank you.